45 people flew into the Andes. 33 survived the crash. Then the search was called off when they heard it happen. On the 13th of October, 1972, a twin-engine turboprop crossed the spine of the Andes, carrying 45 people. Most were young men, a rugby team from Uruguay, their families and friends. The pilot misjudged his position in heavy cloud. He began his descent too early, while a wall of rock still stood in front of him. The wing clipped a ridge, then the tail tore away, and the seats behind it were gone in an instant. What remained of the fuselage dropped like a sled onto a glacier and slid, screaming down the slope until it came to rest in silence. 33 people were still alive. They were more than 11,000 feet up, and no one knew where they had fallen. The cold was the first enemy. At that altitude, night temperatures fell far below freezing. They stacked luggage and seat cushions across the open end of the fuselage to make a wall against the wind. Several who survived the crash did not survive that first night. In the morning, the survivors counted their living and their dead and began to understand the size of what had happened. There were 2 medical students among them, Roberto Canessa and 1 classmate. With no supplies and no training for this, they became the doctors. They set broken legs with scraps from the wreck. They pressed snow to wounds. A boy named Nando Parrado lay in a coma for 3 days, and they left him near the dead, certain he would not wake. He did. Far below in 3 countries, the search had already begun. Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay sent aircraft to sweep the mountains. But the fuselage was white, half buried in a white glacier, invisible from the air. Pilots flew directly over the site and saw nothing. On the ground, the survivors waved and shouted at every distant engine they heard, and the planes flew on. They had almost no food. A little chocolate, some crackers, a few bottles of wine, split among more than 24 people. They rationed it down to a single square of chocolate a day, then to nothing. Around them stretched only rock, ice, and snow. Nothing grew here, nothing lived here. There was no animal to hunt and no plant to eat. Among the wreckage, they found a small transistor radio. One of the boys spent hours coaxing it to work, adjusting a length of wire for an antenna. It could not transmit, it could only receive. But receiving was enough to keep a thread of hope alive. Each day, someone pressed it to their ear and listened, waiting for news of themselves. On the 10th day, one of them held the radio close and went very still. Then he turned to the others. The news had come through. The 3 governments had ended the search. After more than a week of flying blind over the mountains, they had concluded that no one could still be alive up here. The search was over. The world believed they were dead. This is the moment the story turns, not the crash. The people trained to find them, the machines built to save them, had looked at the mountains and decided the mountains had won. And the survivors heard that decision announced in a calm broadcast voice, while their own hearts were still beating. No one was coming. If they wanted to live, they would have to save themselves. Strangely, some of them later said the news brought a kind of clarity. As long as they waited to be rescued, they were passengers in their own fate. Now the waiting was over. There was grief in that broadcast, but there was also a decision hidden inside it. From this day forward, whatever happened to them would be something they chose to do, not something done to them. To choose to live, they faced a decision almost too heavy to speak aloud. Their food was gone, and their bodies were failing. The only source of nourishment left on that glacier was the bodies of their friends who had died. After days of anguish and refusal, they agreed together that the dead would help the living survive. It was a pact made in desperation, and they honored it with grief. We say this plainly and without spectacle, because it is part of the documented record, and because the survivors themselves have spoken of it with honesty and grace. It was the hardest choice human beings can face. They made it so that someone, anyone, might walk off that mountain and carry their story home. Their families would later say they understood. Then the mountain struck again. In the night, an avalanche poured down the slope and buried the fuselage where they slept. Those who could dig clawed through the snow with their hands to reach the faces of the trapped. 8 more died that night, smothered where they lay. The survivors were now sealed inside a tomb of snow, and it took 3 days before they could break their way back out. By now, the survivors understood a hard truth. No one would come, the food would not last, and the mountain would keep killing them a few at a time. Sitting still was a slow death sentence. Someone had to leave. Someone had to climb out of this valley, over the peaks, and find another human being on the far side. The plan was almost impossible, but it was the only plan left. They chose their strongest. Nando Parrado, the boy who had woken from the coma, and Roberto Canessa, the medical student. The others gave up their food and their spare clothing so the two climbers might have a chance. They sewed a rough sleeping bag from insulation stripped out of the plane, a single bag the two men would share against the cold at night. They set out to the west toward Chile, believing green valleys lay just beyond the ridge. They were wrong. The record shows they were far deeper inside the mountains than anyone had guessed. To reach help, they would have to climb a peak nearly 15,000 feet high, with no ropes, no picks, no boots. Only the will to keep placing one foot above the other. The climb took days. The air thinned until every step cost a dozen breaths. At night, they lay in the shared bag as the temperature crashed, holding each other to keep from freezing. Parrado later said he stopped thinking about the summit and thought only of the next step and the one after that. When at last he reached the top, his heart broke. From the summit, he expected to see valleys and roads. Instead, he saw mountains, endless snow peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction. There was no green, no sign of people, nothing but more of the merciless country that had already tried to kill them. Any reasonable man would have turned back. What Parrado decided in that moment became the heart of the whole story. He looked at the impossible distance and, in his own words, decided that if he was going to die anyway, he would die walking toward those mountains rather than sitting still. He called Canessa up to the summit. The two of them looked at the far peaks, chose the lowest gap they could see, and started down the other side. They had already been walking for days. They kept walking. For 10 days they descended, following a valley, then a trickle of meltwater that grew into a stream, then a river. Slowly the snow gave way to bare rock, then to the first thin grass, then to the sound of running water in the green of the lower slopes. They were leaving the death zone, but they were spent, starving at the very end of their strength. On the far side of that river, they saw a man on horseback. He could not cross the rushing water, and they could not shout loud enough over it. So Parrado gestured that they had come from a plane. The next day, the man rode back and threw a stone across the river with paper and a pencil tied to it. On that scrap of paper, Parrado wrote that they had been walking for 10 days, that a crashed plane held survivors still alive, and that they were dying. Helicopters flew back into the mountains, guided by Parrado himself, who refused to stay behind and instead led the pilots to the wreck. On the 23rd of December, 72 days after the crash, the last survivors were lifted off the glacier. 16 of the 45 came home. The search that had been called off found nothing. The survivors, in the end, rescued themselves. There is a lesson buried in this file, and it is not about the mountain. Institutions, working with the best information they had, concluded the case was closed. They were not lying, and they were not careless. They were simply wrong, and 16 people lived because 2 of them refused to accept that verdict. Sometimes the record ends too early, and someone has to walk past its final page. This has been the documented record of the Andes survivors, drawn from their own accounts and the reports of those who brought them home. No conspiracy, no speculation dressed as fact. Just the file, opened and closed with respect for the dead and the living. If a story like this stays with you, stay with us. The next file is already waiting.